do a half hour teaching, no, 40 minutes. You tell me what works. More like 40 minutes. Okay, great. We'll do 40 minutes, and they'll sit for another 20 minutes after that. If anyone has any questions, but I also like mine very. Hello, hello. Hello, hello.
Yeah.
Just to give you the space, and then at the end so she's going to teach for 40 minutes. Perfect. And then and if we can, we'll just make sure to post the text online, so anyone online can follow that way as well. Yes, yeah. No questions about your book that I'd love to. Yeah, so I'll check back in. I'm just going to make sure that we're streaming real quick. Yes, I don't have my phone on me or anything. Oh, no worries. I'm just going to call him real quick to make sure that we're live, and then I'll give you guys. And it's through here, but they pick it up from anywhere, so you don't need to look at the. Exactly. Exactly. Perfect. It's our reward. Yes, absolutely. All right. I'm blocking you in here. All right. I'll just introduce you a second, and great. We're good. Okay, welcome everybody. It's so nice to see you in person. Nice to see you from afar. We're welcoming an amazing teacher today, Gila. I'm going to wait for you to introduce yourself a little bit, because you kind of do a lot of things. You're a teacher, scholar, you lecture, you have been editor. So I want, I'd love for you to introduce yourself a little bit, and then we're going to do some learning together, because that's at the core of who you are. And we're going to learn some text together. We get to really dive in, and that's what we're here for. And then we'll get to talk a little bit about your book at the end. So thank you everybody for being here. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Wow. This is a lot of microphone for very few people. Hello, viewers at home. I'm going to be addressing the people here, but I have you in mind, absolutely. So my name is Gila, and I learn, teach, and write about rabbinic literature. I think that's really all you need to know. And I just published my first book. Thank you very much. I'd much rather talk about that. So rather than me, let's talk about my baby. The Mad Woman in the Rabbi's Attic, rereading the women of the Talmud. So this book really begins 3 days before my 12th birthday. I was visiting my grandparents in London, where I did not grow up, despite the accent. My whole family had gone out to the Science Museum for the day, and I was left behind with a pile of my grandfather's books and strict instructions to write my bat mitzvah speech. No idea why anyone thought that would be the way to go about it. Don't know why anyone thought that would be a good idea, but that's what my parents decided to do. And so, not knowing much about anything, I just reached for the first book on the pile, which was the Book of Legends. Essentially a collection of all of the stories of the Talmud organized according to theme. And I flipped to the theme woman because I figured bat mitzvah. 3 stories in, I felt a little bit uncomfortable. By the 10th, I was in tears, sobbing as only a nearly 12-year-old can. I was so hurt, I was so deeply offended that the rabbis could have such a low opinion of me and my kind. The women in their stories were weak. They were irrational. They were greedy and petty and promiscuous and vain. One of the sources read, "When woman was created, the devil was created with her." So woman was the mother of all vice. Yeah, that's what I said. 3 days before your bat mitzvah, not the best time to lose your religion, but that is what happened to me that day. I cobbled together a couple quotes for my speech, but nothing was the same for me after that. I spiraled into a serious religious crisis. The simple faith of my childhood was gone, and in its place were pain and confusion and doubt. I struggled to make peace with a religion I so loved, knowing that its founding fathers felt about me the way they did. I spent, really, with a mic even louder, okay, it's personal. I spent years searching for answers. After high school and my National Youth Service, I went to seminary to study Talmud, which was forbidden to me growing up, the study of Talmud. But it wasn't until I went to university to study literature that I found the answers I was looking for. Learning to read Talmudic stories as Talmudic stories ought to be read, I discovered that they are not at all what they first appear to be. That there is a great deal more to the women of the Talmud than initially meets the eye. And that the rabbis had some surprising, so as not to say surprisingly feminist, ideas of marriage, sex, childbirth, and what it means to be a woman in the world. It took over a decade of intense religious crisis, but the stories of the Talmud that had so upset me at 12 ended up becoming my constant study and my greatest joy. And this book is a result of that struggle. And to show you a little bit about what I mean, I'd like to take you through the subject of the first chapter of the book, and that is the story of Yalta, the shrew. So let's begin with that last word. What is a shrew? Not rhetorical. What is a shrew? Guys, it's a group effort. Yes.
Angry.
Good, an angry woman. Very good.
And takes it out on everyone around.
Good, fantastic. Wow, we can go home after that. You nailed it. Anything else? So narcissistic, I think, is more true of a prima donna, which is a different archetype I look at in chapter 3 in the book. But harsh, absolutely. Yes, good. So fun fact, shrew in the original sense is actually a small mouse-like mammal known for its aggressive nature and venomous bite. But in the 13th century, the term expands to include this kind of angry, harsh woman known for her aggressive temper and venomous tongue. The name might have appeared only in the 13th century, but the archetype itself is much older. Shrews can be found snarling and scolding their way throughout the Western canon. And let's begin by looking at some of the shrews we know and love. No peeking at the source sheet. If you did, you can't play. All right, let's begin with the... So we'll get there, good. But let's begin with the Bible. There's a classic example, I would say, of a shrew in the Bible. Can anyone tell me who she is? Delilah is a femme fatale, and I look at her in chapter 2 in the book. Think disobedient, angry woman. Vashti, very good. All right, so now you can look at the source sheet. And I'm going to actually begin with a verse from the book of Proverbs. This is number 2. It is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman. Contentious and angry woman, classic definition of the shrew. And then we have, of course, the character of disobedient Queen Vashti, who is, depending on how you read her, because the rabbis kind of have different interpretations of her, but at least in one interpretation, she is a shrew. Let's move from Bible to Talmud. Now, the stories in the Talmud will often appear in groups or cycles on a particular theme. And we have in the Talmud, in Tractate Yevamot, an entire story cycle devoted to the subject of shrews. Can somebody please read number 3 for us? There's a lot of text. We are not a lot of people. You will all have to read. Be warned. Go for it. Thank you.
A loud voice.
Do you want to take the...
Yes.
Hey, thanks. Okay, number 3. Rav was constantly tormented by his wife. If he told her, prepare me lentils, she would prepare him peas. If he asked for peas, she would prepare him lentils. When his son Chia grew up, he reversed his father's requests to her. Rav said to him, your mother has improved. Chia replied, It was I who reversed your requests to her. Rabbi Chia was constantly tormented by his wife. Nevertheless, whenever he would find anything suitable, he would wrap it up in his shawl and bring it to her. Said Rav to him, "But surely she's tormenting the master?" He replied, "It's sufficient for us that they rear up our children and deliver us from sin." Rav Yehuda was reading his son Rav Yitzchak the verse, "And I find more bitter than death the woman." His son asked, "Who, for instance?" His father replied, "For instance, your mother."
Thank you. Notice one of history's first ever Yo Mama jokes right here in the Talmud. What can you tell me about the shrew from these three stories? A tormentor. Good. Very good. What else?
Here sees it in a different way. He says, as long as my wife is raising the kids and keeping me away from trouble, I'm fine with that.
Good. So she may be tormenting me, but if she's the mother of my children, I'm going to put up with it. Good. Anything else?
She interacting with the husband? How is she serving the husband? That's what's being criticized, as opposed to how is she on her own or in her own life.
Okay, good. So I'm going to tell you the thing that I tell my students every time, and that is no feminism allowed. We can't be too feminists because right now we're trying to read the archetype the way it was read historically. So we have to have the thesis before we can deconstruct it. We will be deconstructing it. But first, we're going to try and understand the archetype on its own terms. Let me ask you this. Who do we not see in these three shrew stories?
Children. We don't see the woman.
We don't see the shrew. Good. An entire shrew story cycle, not one shrew to be found. All we have is the husbands. The poor, tormented husbands who are suffering patiently through the antics of their shrewish wives. And this is generally true of the genre. Shrew stories will almost always be told from the point of view of the husband. The perspective of the shrew herself is hardly ever there. In fact, it'll be really interesting to read a shrew story from the perspective of the shrew, which is exactly what we're going to end up doing. But not just yet. All right, let's move from Talmud to Greco-Roman literature. Are there any don't peek. No peeking. Any classicists here? Can anyone tell me who the great shrew is of Greco-Roman literature?
I don't know what Lucretia.
Actually, Lucretia's a pretty good, solid, chaste, obedient woman. You mean Lucrece from The Rape of Lucrece? Yeah, no, she's actually a very good, obedient woman. So the great Greek philosopher Socrates, have you heard of him? Great Greek philosopher. He was married to Xanthippe. There is no historical evidence of this, but every single time Xanthippe is described in the literature, it is always as a shrew from hell. Can somebody please read number 4 for us? We'll skip the first source. Let's go directly to the second source in number 4. The first word in this source is Alcibiades. Can somebody read it for us, please? You know what? I think we're just going to go round.
Yeah, Rosa, do you want to read those?
Thank you.
Alcibiades sent to Socrates a large and beautifully made cake. Xanthippe, who was rather jealous of the giver, took it out of the basket and stamped upon it. Socrates only smiled and said, "Now, my dear, you will not get a slice of it any more than I."
Thank you. What can you tell me about the shrew from this story?
Jealous.
Jealous. Good. Anything else?
Well, the story is that your jealousy goes against you too.
Good. Self-destructive. She's so angry here, she doesn't even care that the cake she's destroying is basically she's destroying it for herself as well, as Socrates points out. Very good. And notice how Socrates, very much like the rabbis of the Talmud, is just enduring his wife with a great deal of patience. In the first source, he says, very much like Rav Chia, well, she's the mother of my children, so what are you going to do? All right, moving on from classical to medieval literature. Couple of interesting examples here. Let's begin with Arabian Nights, which is absolutely full of shrews, although probably the most notorious, is Fatima, the wife of the cobbler Maruf. Would you read the next source for us in number 5?
Here, take the mic.
There dwelt once in the city of Cairo the god guarded a cobbler who lived by mending old shoes. His name was Maruf, and he had a wife called Fatima, whom the folk had nicknamed the Shrew. For that she was a worthless, ill-conditioned wretch, little of shame and a sore mischief maker. She ruled her husband and used to revile him and curse him 1,000 times a day. And he feared her malice and dreaded her mischief.
Thank you. So the story continues that Fatima one day decides she wants a cake. And she sends Maruf out to get her it. Now, Maruf really is not a wealthy man. He can't afford any of the cakes that are on sale. But then he finds a baker who takes pity on him because he's married to this awful woman. And he says, you know what, take this cake for free. So Maruf comes home with this cake, but it's not the fancy one that Fatima wanted. And so she flies into a fit and throws the cake in Maruf's face and knocks out one of his teeth. What can you tell me about the shrew from this story? Selfish, good. Violent, very good. She's violent. Anything else? Quick to anger. And I want to say that perhaps if I had to give one word to describe the shrew, it would be mad. And I mean that word in the double sense, or at least the American double sense. The shrew as a mad woman is both angry and crazy, raging and deranged. Another famous medieval shrew is the wife of Bath from the Canterbury Tales. She's a good one. Who basically is very proud of the fact that she had 6 husbands and she ruined the lives of each and every one of them. And then another famous shrew from this time, the medievals were very fond of staging plays based on different biblical stories. They would do this during their religious holidays. And one story they were particularly fond of was Noah and the flood. Now, Noah's wife, who barely gets a mention in the Bible, takes center stage of these plays, again, as an absolute shrew from hell. She refuses to believe there's going to be a flood. She refuses to get onto the ark. She hits, kicks, curses, and sits on poor Noah. And then at some point, she has to be dragged, kicking and screaming, onto the ark. I'll explain in a moment why I pointed when you laughed there. And then we get to early modern literature, and arguably the most famous shrew of the Western canon, who is The Taming of the Shrew, Katerina Minola from The Taming of the Shrew by William Shakespeare. Would you be Petruchio, please? And I'm going to let you be Katerina.
Thou hast hit it. Come, sit on me.
Right. Asses are made to bear, and so are you.
Women are made to bear, and so are you.
No such jade as you, if me you mean.
Come, you wasp. Is that I faith you are too angry?
If I be waspish, best beware my sting.
Who knows not where a wasp does wear his sting? In his tail?
In his tongue.
Whose tongue?
Yours, if you talk of tales, and so farewell.
What? With my tongue in your tail? Nay, come again, good Kate. I am a gentleman.
That I'll say.
And about 100 years after the taming of the shrew, William Congreve coins the motto for shrews everywhere when he says, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." Moving down to the 19th century, bunch of examples. We'll merely mention a few of them. The first one is American, just to show you that the shrew did in fact make her way to America. And that is the most famous American short story. What is the most famous American short story? This is legit what it's called. Rip Van Winkle. Very good. So Rip Van Winkle is famous for having traveled through time and slept through the American Revolution. What people don't know as much is that the reason that he goes time traveling in the first place is to get away from his wife, who just makes his life an absolute misery. Going back to the UK, we have Mrs. Jo Gargery from Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. Remember her? Let me ask you this. What is the genre of the shrew story? Think of the examples we've just read. What genre do they belong to? What type of stories are these stories? They're all fiction. Well, by virtue of the fact that they're stories, they are fiction. But what type of stories? Sorry? Farce. Good. These stories are comedies, which is why I pointed when you laugh. These stories are always comedic. Now, the reason for this is that comedy is a product of incongruity. Bringing together two things that generally do not belong together is what makes us laugh. So a cat playing the piano is funny because cats generally do not play pianos. A violent woman is like a piano-playing cat. She is incongruous, therefore she is humorous. There is something inherently comedic about a woman who hits and kicks and curses. But the final shrew I want to talk about before we actually get to our shrew, Yalta, comes to us in a dramatic rather than comedic setting, and that is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Now, if you haven't read Jane Eyre and you would like to one day read it, and I highly recommend, I'm going to ask that you close your ears for the next minute or so because I'm about to spoil the novel for you, so be warned. The secret, you guys at home as well, the secret at the heart of Jane Eyre is that Mr. Rochester, Jane's love interest, is in fact already married, and his wife, Bertha Mason, is a madwoman locked away in the household attic. Now, this is the shrew taken to a mad and murderous extreme, as Bertha a number of times tries to kill her husband and burn the house down. And would you please read number 10 for us? Can we get the microphone back?
From Jane Eyre. In the deep shade at the far end In the deep shade at the farther end of the room, a figure ran backward and forward. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not at first sight tell. It groveled seemingly on all fours. It snatched and growled like some strange wild animal. But it was covered with clothing, and a quantity of dark grizzled hair, wild as a mane, hid its head and face. Mr. Rochester flung me behind him. The lunatic sprang and grappled his throat viciously and laid her teeth to his cheek. They struggled. She was a big woman, in stature almost equaling her husband, and corpulent besides. She showed virile force in the contest. More than once she almost throttled him.
Thank you. Do you think maybe we could close the door there? Thank you. All right, so this is the shrew. She is a mad woman, again, in the double sense of both angry and crazy. She is the who flies into fits and attacks those around her. She is the wife of a timid and terrorized husband who puts up with her temper and does his best to placate her. She is a comedic figure whose story, always told from the point of view of said suffering husband, features scenes of verbal abuse or physical violence, and sometimes both. So now that we've defined the archetype, let us move to the great shrew of the Talmud, Yalta. Yalta is the Aramaic version of which Hebrew name? Can anyone guess? What does it sound like? Yael, very good. Yalta is the most named woman of the Talmud. She's mentioned by name more than any other. She's lived during the 3rd century in Babylon. She's generally regarded as the daughter of the exilarch, basically the leader of the Babylonian Jewish community, and as the wife of Rav Nachman, one of the leading scholars of his time. But of all the stories we have about Yalta, the earliest one, the one in Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Brachot, page 51b, is the most famous. And let's begin by doing a straight read-through of the entire story beginning to end. This is the story in number 1. Would you pick up the reading for us, please? Would you read number 1? And I will interrupt you constantly.
Okay. Yes. Ula was once at the house of Rav Nachman.
Thank you. So, I did tell you I was going to interrupt. During this time, the 3rd century, the Jewish world operated around 2 rabbinic centers. You had the center in Israel, and you had the center in Babylon. Now, these centers would communicate via rabbinic messengers, people who would travel backwards and forwards and teach the rabbis in each country what the rabbis in the other country were saying. Ula was a great Israeli scholar who would often travel to Babylon on business. He was a merchant. And so he acted as one such rabbinic messenger. As we are told, on one of his many trips through Babylon, Ula is hosted by his friend and rabbinic colleague, Rav Nachman. Continue, please.
He had a meal, said the grace after meals, and handed the cup of blessing to Rav Nachman.
Thank you. And so they have a meal. They end by saying the blessing after the meals, which is traditionally recited over a cup of wine. Some people do this to this day in their homes on Shabbat. You might have seen this done in Jewish weddings. You pour a cup of wine, you recite the entire blessing, and at the end of the blessing, you drink. Ula, as the guest, is given the honor of leading the blessing, and so he says the blessing, he drinks from the cup, and then he gives the cup to Rav Nachman, the host, who also drinks. Continue, please.
Rav Nachman said to him, Master, please send the cup of blessing to Yalta.
Thank you. And then Rav Nachman says, please send the cup to my wife. Now, the word send implies that Yalta was not actually at the table with the men. She was somewhere close by. Continue, please.
Ula responded, so said Rabbi Yohanan, the fruit of a woman's body is blessed only from the fruit of a man's body. As it is written, he will bless you, he will bless the fruit of your body. It does not say the fruit of her body, but the fruit of your body.
Thank you. And so Ula sees this as a perfect opportunity to teach his Babylonian friend some words of Israeli Torah. And so according to Rabbi Yochanan, the great rabbi back in Israel, women do not drink from the cup of blessing. Because the blessing in the cup, which is generally believed to be the blessing of childbirth, will be transmitted to the woman through her husband. And it is enough that the husband drink and be blessed. This is a fairly standard argument that we've seen throughout history for the exclusion of women. Women do not need to take part in something or be represented in something because they can do so through the proxy of their husbands. Continue, please.
Meanwhile, Yalta heard, and she got up in a passion and went to the wine storehouse and broke 400 jars of wine.
Thank you. You see, comedy, you're laughing. So Yalta hears this. She flies into a fit. She storms up to the wine store as in the place where they would store the wine. And mad woman in the attic that she is, she smashes 400 jars of wine. She is so angry and violent and self-destructive, she doesn't even care that the wine she is destroying, very much like, remember Xanthippes' cake, is in fact her own. If she can't have wine, no one is having wine. Let's read on.
Continue. Okay. Rav Nachman said to him, "Let the master send her another cup."
Thank you. Do you get the comedy here? This is funny. Yalta has just smashed 400 jars of their wine, and all poor Rav Nachman can do is say, please send her another cup, please, before she breaks anything else. So this is a thoroughly whipped husband. Let's read on.
He sent it to her with a message. All that wine can be counted as a blessing.
Thank you. And so Ula sends Yalta another cup, but he can't help it. He's a rabbinic messenger. He's got to teach something. And so he sends it to her with a message. All the wine is equally blessed. Now, this is true halachically. According to Jewish law, if you make a blessing over a cup of wine, all the wine in the area becomes blessed. And so what Ula basically is saying to Yalta is, first of all, you're ignorant. You don't know the law. And second, if you did know the law, you'd realize that you could have drunk from any cup and you didn't need this particular one. You have just completely overreacted. There was no call for this violent outburst. Let's finish up.
She returned answer, "Gossip comes from peddlers and lies from rags."
Thank you. I love this. It's one of great comebacks in all of the Talmud. Gossip comes from peddlers and lies from rags. You can almost see the... Do you know what I mean when I do this? My students tell me I can't pull it off because I'm not American. Do you know what I mean, though? Thank you. It's a weird final line. Scholars don't really know what to make of it. It's generally interpreted as Yalta trying to insult Ula any which way she possibly can. We know that Ula is a merchant, so she's basically saying to him, you, Ula, are nothing but a rag-wearing, gossiping, lice-infested peddler. And so that's far the story of Yalta. And it appears at face value that we have before us a classic shrew narrative. We have the comedy, we have the verbal abuse and the physical violence, we have the whipped husband, and most importantly, we have the bad-tempered mad woman who doesn't get her own way and unleashes her anger at everything in her path. Which is more or less how you defined her right when we started. But I want to ask, as we must always ask when we read a story in the Talmud, is this really the story the Talmud is telling? Spoiler, the answer to that question is almost always no. One of the hallmarks of Talmudic storytelling is the false front, meaning what these stories seem to be saying and what they are actually saying are often diametrically opposite. Excuse me. The rabbis write their stories so as to deliberately mislead us, such that if we only read them once, we will come away with the wrong idea. So Talmudic stories can never just be read, they must always be reread. Hence the book's subtitle, Rereading the Women of the Talmud. And so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to reread the story of Yalta. And I want to begin our rereading with another rereading of the story of the other mad woman in the attic, and I want to go back to Bertha Mason from Jane Eyre. Now, Jane Eyre was published in the 19th century, huge hit. Sorry, it really was. In the 20th century, British Dominican novelist Jean Rhys came along and said, hang on, we don't know anything about Bertha Mason save the fact that she is a mad woman in an attic. But no mad woman in an attic is a mad woman in an attic born. Something must have happened to get her to be this way. And so Jean Rees decides to write her story. The result is Wide Sargasso Sea, which is a very beautiful, very poignant prequel to Jane Eyre. Prequel, the opposite of sequel, the story that comes before Jane Eyre. It is the story of Bertha Mason's childhood as a daughter of a slave owner in post-emancipation Jamaica. After the emancipation, the natives turn on Bertha and her family. They burn her house down, they kill her baby brother, and they send her mother spiraling into madness. Amanda, you've not been here. Would you read for us, please? This is number 12.
As I knew they would be, they were waiting for me under the sandbox tree. There were two of them, a boy and a girl. They looked so harmless and quiet, no one would have noticed the glint in the boy's eyes. Then the girl grinned and began to crack the knuckles of her fingers. At each crack, I jumped and my hands began to sweat. I was holding some school books in my right hand and I shifted them to under my arm, but it was too late. There was a mark on the palm of my hand and a stain on the cover of the book. They closed in on me and started talking. The girl said, "Look, the crazy girl, you crazy like your mother. Your aunt frightened to have you in the house. She sent you for the nuns to lock up. Your mother walked about with no shoes and stockings on her feet. She tried to kill her husband and she tried to kill you too. That day you go to see her. She have eyes like zombie and you have eyes like zombie too. You don't want to look at me, eh? I make you look at me." She pushed me and the books I was carrying fell to the ground.
Thank you. And this, says Jean Rees, this is what drives Bertha Mason to insanity. You crazy like your mother. Treat someone as if they are mad often enough, and they will eventually become so. A very similar argument is made by 20th century theorist Susie Kaplow in an essay titled Getting Angry, which discusses the fraught relationship between women and anger. When men get angry, says Kaplow, they are indignant. When women get angry, they are irrational. And this too becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Treat a woman as if she is irrational, ill-tempered, and shrewish, and she will become irrational, ill-tempered, and shrewish. Would you carry on with number 13, please? Thank you.
A woman in our society is denied the forthright expression of her healthy anger. Her attempts at physical confrontation seem ridiculous. Ladies, do a slow burn, letting out their anger indirectly in catty little phrases, often directed against a third party, especially children. A woman has learned to hold back her anger. It's unseemly, aesthetically displeasing, and against the sweet, pliant feminine image to be angry. And the woman fears her own anger. She, the great conciliator, the steadier of rocked boats, moves out of her fear to quiet not only others' anger, but also her own. Small wonder that when the vacuum-sealed lid bursts off, the angry woman seems like a freaked-out nut. Her frenzy is intensified by the shakiness of her commitment to her own anger. What if she's really wrong? What if the other person is right, or worse? And that is the greatest fear. Hits back with, "You're crazy. I don't know what you're so mad about."
Thank you. And this, says Kaplow, is how the shrew goes from angry to crazy, from raging to deranged. A woman who is mad is easily turned into a mad woman. All that it takes is someone to treat her that way. "You're crazy, I don't know what you're so mad about." Exactly the response that Ulla gives Yalta after she smashes all those jars of wine. Ulla dismisses Yalta as a raging shrew. But is that really who she is? So let's review the evidence. Now in the book, I actually show exactly how we have to reread the stories of the Talmud. I say we have to zoom in and do a close reading of the text, and we have to zoom out and look at the context. And I want to begin with the context. I mentioned that Yalta was the most named woman of the Talmud. So let's look at some of the other stories we have about Yalta in the Talmud and see if she really is the shrew that Ula accuses her of being. Number 14, where are we up to with our readers? I think it's you. Thank you.
Yalta once brought some blood to Rabbi Bar-Hana, who informed her that it was impure. She then took it to Rav Yitzhak, son of Rav Yehuda, who told her that it was pure. But how could he act in this manner, seeing that it was taught? If a rabbi declared anything impure, another rabbi may not declare it pure. At first, he informed her that it was indeed impure. However, when she told him that every time she brings this kind of blood to Rabbi Bar-Hana, he declares it pure, but that on the last occasion he had a pain in his eye, Rav Yitzhak gave her his ruling that it was pure.
Thank you. So it's a complicated story, I agree. The story is in Tractate Nida, meaning menstruation. It's all about what types of spotting render a woman a menstruant. If a woman is menstruating, then according to the Jewish tradition, she's not allowed to have relations with her husband. And so the whole question of how you diagnose the blood to determine whether it is menstrual blood or not menstrual blood is a very complicated one. It is discussed at length in the Talmud. And we have here a story in this tractate in the Talmud of Yalta, who has a blood stain, and she's not sure whether it is menstrual blood or not. And she takes it to her rabbi. I should say parenthetically, today, women who want to get answers on these types of questions go to women, not to rabbis. We have progressed in that respect, thank God. She takes this blood spot to Rabbi Bar-Hana, who tells her, yes, it is menstrual blood, you are impure, you can't have sex with your husband. And then Yalta does something you're not meant to do. She seeks a second opinion. Basically, once you've asked a rabbi a question, what he tells you, you have to do. But the Talmud says she was right to seek a second halachic opinion because the first rabbi couldn't see properly, therefore he couldn't diagnose the blood. I should say parenthetically that the reason the Talmud tells the story is to tell us that women are the best authorities over their own bodies and they should be trusted. They know their own periods. What can you tell me about Yalta from this story? What sort of person is she? Inquisitive, good. What does that imply that she's inquisitive? Because she's what? Yep. She's persistent, absolutely, good. She's resourceful, good. She knows her stuff, very good. This is a woman who is highly intelligent and extremely knowledgeable. When Ula said to her, you're ignorant, you don't know the law, clearly this is a woman who knows the law extremely well. Would you read the next source in number 14, please?
Yalta said to Rav Nachman, everything that the Torah published, it permitted a corresponding thing. It prohibited blood. It prohibited liver, a menstruating woman, pure blood, the fat of domesticated animals, the fat of wild animals, pork, the brain of a carp, the marsh hen, the tongue of a fish, a married woman, a divorce in her husband's lifetime, a brother's wife, a Levirate bride, a Samaritan woman, a beautiful captive woman. I would like to eat milk and meat, Rav Nachman told the cooks. Roost her and udder.
Thank you. For every law, says Yalta to Rav Nachman, there is a loophole. We cannot have bloody meat, but we can have liver, which is a naturally bloody piece of meat. We cannot have pork, but we can have a shibuta. So if any of you are curious about the taste of pork, all you have to do is figure out what a shibuta is and then find it and eat it, because apparently they have the same flavor. I want to eat. Sorry? You kind of have to wonder how the rabbis knew this to be true. That's absolutely right. I want to eat milk and meat, says the Alta. Find me the loophole for that. And Rav Nachman tells the cooks, roast her and udder. Now this is the halachically permissible way to have milk and meat. The Talmud tells us that if you have an udder and you open it up and you let the milk spill out, any milk that remains seeped within the flesh is permissible. So you can all go off and buy udders for Shabbat. What can you tell me about Yalta from this source? She knows the law through and through. She knows it so well, she can like push the boundaries, right? Anything else? Good. How would you characterize the relationship?
It seems to be, it's an intellectual relationship.
Good. Yes, there does seem to be a mutual intellectual respect between Rav Nachman and his wife. Good. I think we're back to you. Would you read the next source for us, please? Yes, this is interactive.
When the household of the Exarch would afflict Rav Amram the pious, they made him lie down in the snow. Yalta heard and took him into the bathhouse and bathed him till the water of the bathhouse turned the color of blood and his flesh was covered with bright spots.
Thank you. So when the servants of the Exarch, meaning the leader of the Babylonian Jewish community, wanted to torment Rav Amram the pious, we're not entirely sure why they had it in for poor Rav Nachman. The great medieval commentator Rashi suggests that he was annoyingly pious. They make him lie down in the snow and they give him frostbite. Yalta hears this and arranges for him to be taken to the bathhouse and nursed back to health. What can you tell me about Yalta from this story? She's compassionate. Good. Anything else? And she's proactive. Very good. Very good. We don't know. The story doesn't tell us. Let's read one more source. Would you please read the last one for us in 14?
Rav Nachman said to Rav Yehuda, "Let Donek come and pour us drinks." Rav Yehuda replied, "Shmuel said, one should not make use of a woman." Rav Nachman said, "She is a minor." Rav Yehuda replied, "Shmuel explicitly said one should not make use of a woman at all, whether adult or minor." Rav Nachman said, "Would the master send a greeting to Yalta?" Rav Yehuda replied, "Shmuel said a woman's voice is considered indecent." Rav Nachman said, "Through a messenger." Rav Yehuda replied, "Shmuel said one should not send greetings to a woman." Rav Nachman said, "Through her husband." Rav Yehuda replied, "Shmuel said one should not send greetings to a woman at all." His wife sent Rav Nachman a message, "Conclude his business and let him go, lest he make you as an ignoramus."
Thank you. So notice how this story is actually quite similar to our story in number 1. In both cases, we have a guest showing up at Rav Nachman and Yalta's house. In both cases, Rav Nachman asks that Yalta, the lady of the house, be acknowledged by the guest. And in both cases, the guest refuses because she is a woman. So 2 very similar stories, 2 diametrically opposite responses on Yalta's part. In this case, she doesn't break anything. She doesn't curse anyone. She doesn't throw any tantrums. She simply tiptoes over to her husband and says, "Get rid of him. He's embarrassing you." What can you tell me about Yalta from this story? Very practical. Good. She rises above. Very good. Anything else? Right. She's in proximity at number 1 as well.
She has to be hearing all of the pieces.
Yes. She's protective of her husband. Very good. So emerging from all of these stories is an image of a woman who is extremely knowledgeable and highly intelligent, who's able to rise above adversity and be compassionate, and is extremely protective of her husband's honor. So hardly your typical shrew. That's the broad context. The next thing we have to do is look at the immediate context. We learn a lot about the stories of the Talmud. Do you want to say something? We learn a lot about the stories in the Talmud from the way the rabbis choose to frame them. So let's zoom out and see what happens in the Talmud directly before our story begins. So directly before our story is a whole legal discussion about this cup of blessing. What do we do with this cup? What it should look like? How big it should be? How it should be poured? Etc., etc. And then the last thing the Talmud says right before the story of Yalta is, and this is the last line in number 15, he sends it round to the members of his household so that his wife may be blessed. And then immediately we have the story of Yalta and Ula. What can you tell me about the story from the way the rabbis frame it?
I missed that. I missed what you just said.
In number 15,
Yes.
that's what happens right before the story number 1.
So the line directly, thank you, before our story begins is, he sends the cup round to the members of his household so that his wife may be blessed. Why do the rabbis frame the story like this? What are they trying to say? The rabbis are on Yalta's side. Yes, women should be given the cup. Yes, women should be blessed. So it seems that in this conflict between Ula and Yalta, the rabbis are absolutely on Yalta's side. By the way, another clue as to whose side they're on is on the second end of the framing, the way they end the story. Who gets the last word in the story in number 1? Yalta does. You can generally tell whose side the rabbis are on by who they choose to give the last word to. And the men in the story do all the talking, but Yalta gets the final word. All right, so we've zoomed out, we've looked at the broad context, we looked at the immediate context. The last thing we need to do is we have to zoom in and do a second close reading of the text. Would you pick up number 1 for us, please? We're going to do a rereading of number 1, and this time we're going to do it more carefully, and we're going to try and read it. Unlike all shrew narratives, we're going to try and do it from the perspective of the woman herself. Go.
Ula was once at the house of Rav Nachman. He had a meal, said the grace after meals, and handed the cup of blessing to Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said to him, "Master, please send the cup of blessing to
Number
Yalta."
1. Sorry, go on.
No. Ula responded, So said Rabbi Yochanan, "The fruit of a woman's body is blessed only from the fruit of a man's body. As it is written, he will bless the fruit of your body. It does not say the fruit of her body, but the fruit of your body."
Thank you. Let's stop there. So once again, Rav Nachman says to Ula, "Please send the cup to my wife." And Ula explains, no, women don't have to drink because they will receive the blessing through their husbands. Now, if we zoom out again, and once again we look at the context, and this time I wanted to talk about the historical context, we realize that what Ula is saying here is not a chauvinistic attempt to just exclude women. What Ula is saying is a basic biological fact. Because according to almost all ancient theories of reproduction, the power of procreation belonged exclusively to man. It was man who created life through the force of his seed, whereas woman was merely a human incubator that carried that life inside of her. There are many sources, we won't read them, but both in Greco-Roman biological writings And in rabbinic sources, you have the woman again and again discussed as a vessel.
Even the mitzvah of procreation of fruit or food is a mitzvah for men.
Exactly right. And arguably, that is informed by this biological view. Man creates life, so the commandment to create life is on him. Woman is a receptacle to carry that life inside of her. And the woman's womb, again, both in classical and rabbinic tradition, is described again and again as an upside-down jar, lying hollow inside the woman's body and waiting to be filled. And so what Ula is saying makes perfect sense. Man is the primary agent of childbirth, and he alone should be blessed for it. Woman is ancillary at best, and she will receive the blessing when she receives the man's blessed seed into the vessel that is her womb. So far, so good? Let's read on.
Meanwhile, Yalta heard, and she got up in a passion and went to the wine storehouse and broke 400 jars of wine.
Thank you. I'm going to claim that this is no temper tantrum. This is no temper tantrum. This is not Yalta breaking the jars out of jealous spite. If I can't get wine, no one is getting wine. This is a very clever, very sophisticated response to the biological argument that Ula has just made. Vessels are unimportant, are they? Okay. Let's see how you do without vessels. I'm not going to touch the wine. I'm just going to deconstruct the vessels. And if vessels are so unimportant, it shouldn't make any difference now, should it? Let's read on.
Rav Nachman said to him, "Let the master send her another cup." He sent it to her with a message. All that wine can be counted as a blessing.
Thank you. And again, I'm going to claim that there is some serious subtext here. Because if Ula genuinely believed that the law is that all the wine is equally blessed, he would have said that the first time Rav Nachman asked him to send Yalta the cup. But Ula understands perfectly well what Yalta has just tried to tell him. And he responds in kind. So let's review the symbolism of the story. There are two main symbols in our story. What are they? The wine and the vessel. Good. What does the wine symbolize? The seed, and the vessel is the womb. Fantastic. By saying to Yalta, all the wine is blessed, you did not need this particular cup, Ula is doubling down. Yes, vessels are not important. They're interchangeable. The only thing that is important is what is inside the vessel, i.e. the wine, i.e. man's seed. And yes, procreation is absolutely a male power. Let's finish up.
She returned answer.
At the end, we'll have a lot of time for questions, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Gossip comes from peddlers and lice from rags.
Thank you. So now that we know that there is a biological subtext to this story, I think we can understand this otherwise strange final line. And again, let's zoom out into the historical context. In ancient biology, lice were believed to spontaneously generate. So you didn't need a mother louse and a father louse to create a little baby louse. Lice was simply born out of the air, which is why the Talmud tells us that you can kill lice on Shabbat, because they're not considered a real animal. If you take the female out of procreation, says Yalta to Ula, you might be able to generate lice. You might be able to reproduce gossip. But for any real act of procreation, you need both female and male, vessel and seed. Women may be vessels, but they are no less essential to the creation of life. So now that we've reread the story of Yalta, we find that it is very different to how we read it at first. This is not a petty fight over a cup of wine. This is a principled debate over the power of procreation. This is not an outburst of verbal and physical violence. This is a highly intelligent argument in favor of women's reproductive worth. And this is not a shrew storming off in a temper tantrum. This is a rational, self-possessed woman who stays and fights the system from within. And this final point, for me, is Yalta at her most remarkable. Notice that at no point does Yalta say, I am not a vessel. The dominant biological tradition of her time decreed that women were vessels, and Yalta accepts that. But within that tradition, Yalta tries to carve out a space for herself. As such, Yalta, for me, is the ideal reader, and it's her strategy that I adopt in the book when I try and read the stories of the women of the Talmud. Because not everything we find in the Talmud is going to sit well with our 21st century sensibilities. And the point is not to reject these traditions. Rather, like Yalta, we must accept these traditions as our own and try and carve out a space for ourselves within them. And if we do so, we might just find, like we did with Yalta's story, that these traditions perhaps aren't as far from what we believe in after all. But the final point I want to make, and with this I will end, is an ethical one. I say in the book that when the rabbis tell the story of a woman, 9 times out of 10, they tell a story of an other, with a capital O. And in these stories, they try and impart moral messages about how to treat the others in our midst. And so I think the final message of the story of Yalta is this. Ulla dismisses Yalta for being a raging shrew. And so do generations of readers after him who never bother to look at the story more closely or from Yalta's point of view. And dismissal, as we've seen, is the worst kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Katerina from Shakespeare says, "If I be waspish, best beware my sting. Treat me like a snarling, scratching, biting female, and I will be a snarling, scratching, biting female." Shylock, another famous Shakespearean other, says, "Thou calledst me dog before thou hadst a cause, but since I am a dog, beware my fangs. Treat me like a heartless Jew monster, and I will be a heartless Jew monster, and I will demand my pound of flesh." We saw that Bertha Mason was mocked for being crazy until she was in fact driven mad. And in the Talmud, we have the rabbinic interpretation of the biblical story of Timnah, who was a Horite princess who wanted very much to convert and join the Jewish people. But our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, dismiss her as unworthy, and so Timnah goes off and gives birth to Amalek, arch enemy of the Jewish people. Dismiss someone as irrational or wicked or unworthy, and they will become the very thing you dismiss them for. And it's something we all do. We saw how men in the archetype of the shrew will sometimes dismiss women, but adults dismiss children all the time. We dismiss people whose culture we do not immediately understand. And these days, we dismiss just about anyone who does not see eye to eye with us. And so the next time you're about to dismiss someone, and again, we all do more often than we know, pause and think of Yalta, of how unfairly she was dismissed, and give that person a hearing. You may not end up agreeing with them, and that's fine, but at least you will not have created another mad woman in the attic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, yeah, this is allowed. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I know we're at time, but if anybody has a question, just while you're here, I don't know if you have a few minutes.
Take however much time
I
you
just
like.
want to make sure, as you're all sitting here, if you have any questions, that we get to it.
I think Edie had one earlier. Do you want to repeat? Do you want to say it?
Remember
Okay.
But it really had to do with the fact that they didn't understand reproduction.
No, they didn't.
And they didn't know how, she's a vessel. They didn't know that there was something in the vessel.
Exactly. So they didn't know because, go on.
So we're talking about people who didn't know enough to be really intelligent about the situation.
Which is also, Edie, it's something we talk about, all the time, is I think it goes to your piece of assumptions, and how do we meet people who we don't understand. And so much of it is when we don't have all the information, when we make assumptions about our understanding of other, that is when we make certain judgment calls.
100%. And I'll say in defense of the ancients, you know, this was before X-rays and microscopes and the fancy technology we have today. But it is not at all impossible that 1,000 years from now, they'll look at how we see reproduction and they'll say they've got it completely wrong. There was so much they didn't know. There was so much they didn't see, because we're constantly advancing. So we do the best with the knowledge that we have. And at the same time, we try and be humble, knowing that we haven't got the full picture.
Thank you.
You know, I feel like we could sit for another hour and ask so many questions, but I just have to ask a couple questions.
Go ahead.
One, is there anyone who didn't make it in the book?
Good question. So the way I chose the 6 women in the book is there are exactly 52 named women in all of rabbinic literature. Most women in rabbinic literature are not named. We have the mother of Rabbi X, or the daughter of Rabbi Y, or the wife of Rabbi Z. Very few women actually have their own name. 52 exactly, as opposed to over 1,000 named men. And of these 52, and I know this because I went through them one by one, exactly 6 are heroines of their own rich literary narrative. And so those are the 6.
So the 6 made it in.
Those are the 6 that made it in. There are other very interesting women who don't have names. There are other women who have names, but their stories didn't feel really interesting to me. Those are the 6, and there's a great deal more to explore and write about.
Beautiful. Thank you. And what's next? What's coming next? I know you said this is your first book. This is your baby. This is the focus. What comes next?
So I wrote this book as the first of a trilogy.
Oh, glad I got that question in there.
I'm beginning to think about the next one now. It will be about rabbinic stories, because that's really the only thing I'm equipped to do in this world. That and shopping.
You're in a good city for it.
The next 2 will be rather different, I think, both in form and in content. So the stories I will look at will not be about women, or not specifically about women. And I'm going to look at them in a slightly different way, with slightly different methodology. And that's really all I want to say right now, because I'm still at the very beginning.
That's totally. We can't wait for the next one to have you back to share when that happens. And I want to also pick up on something you said about form and content, that if you haven't looked at this book yet, one, you can talk to Amanda about, I know we purchased them. They're on their way. They didn't get here on time, but Amanda will have them available for purchase. One of the things I totally loved about this book, and it's unlike most books, is that there are charts and images and footnotes in here, and it's not just written in prose, but it's engaging on so many different levels. And, you know, I'll just show you as you're sitting here and at home.
I love that you've bookmarked it.
Oh, yeah. No, it's, you know, it's always a back and forth. Do I write in the book directly, or do I write on the bookmarks? But you could see, you know, everything's charted out in different ways and things that you would never think about in these stories unless they're written side by side other parts of the story, unless they're written side by side another story, unless it's written out in this manner. And it's just amazing that you were able to include this in this book. So thank you for that gift. And with that, I just want to say thank you again. It's really such a treat to have you here, and I'm glad we made this happen. And we'll be meeting a month from now, I'd like to say, or something. You know, everything's on the website, in the emails for our next Women's Perspective. And we meet in person, Sisterhood Conference Room. Bring your lunch. And thank you, everybody, for being here. We'll take a few minutes if anyone has a book, if a few minutes to sign the book. Any other questions? And good to see you. We're going to close the streaming, but for those here in person, there's a little more time.